We had so much fun in the other episode talking about OS utilities. I'm like, why don't we just keep going? Now keep in mind, I am going through the utilities that are specified in the CompTIA Security Plus SY0501. So I'm not saying this is all there is, but these are definitely on the exam. So the next thing I think we should be talking about is really not just one utility, but a bunch of different utilities that kind of work the same way. So I'm just going to call this ipconfig. There's a lot of scenarios in the IT security world where you have to answer one basic question. Who am I and how am I configured? So what I want to talk about real quick are really three different commands that do the same thing. ipconfig, the IP command, and the deprecated ifconfig. So actually, I'm just going to talk about two commands. ipconfig, which is a Windows tool, and IP, which is a Linux tool. ifconfig is, like I said, deprecated, although there are ways if you actually want to install it and use it, you still can. The important thing is that the IP command does everything the ifconfig command does and a little bit more, so we'll just stick with that one. So let's go ahead and start with ipconfig. So I'm just going to go ahead and run ipconfig here on my Windows system. Now if I run it by itself, it gives me a lot of great information. In particular, I've got my IPv6 address. Now Windows does temporary IPv6 addresses, so those change very, very quickly. I've got my link local IPv6 address, I got my IPv4 address, my subnet mask, and my default gateway. The big deal here is not that ipconfig is that unique of a command. What gets people in trouble is that you have to know your network for the ipconfig command to do you any good. For example, the network ID that I'm doing this video shoot on is 192.168.4. And if we take a look up here, we'll see that I have a 192.168.4 address. So life is good. Now I've also got I've got a virtual machine on here, and this is the Teredo tunneling adapter, which you'll still see in Windows 10. The only thing I'm really interested in right here is my Ethernet adapter. So ipconfig by itself is handy, but if you really want to get some good information, do an ipconfig/all. And this is going to give you a lot of really detailed information. Now I need to warn you, Security Plus, well, CompTIA is a little bit notorious for taking questions from other types of certification and plopping them in one certification. So a great example would be right here, where you might see a A+ type question where it's like, gee, how can you determine what your MAC address is? And the answer is that you have to type ipconfig/all, and if you look right there, there's my MAC address. So any type of scenario where you need to ask a question, who am I? ipconfig is going to be your go-to tool. Now, the other thing I need to stress is that if you know your network, you can get great information here. Like for example, here's my IPv4 address, and it's 192.168.4.34. What if it suddenly became 169.254? Well, now I know I've got a DHCP problem. Or what, heaven forbid, it becomes 10.11.13 or something like that. I might have a rogue DHCP server. So the power of ipconfig is knowing your network and being able to make a quick snapshot and look for situations that might be causing problems. So what I want to do now is let's do this all over again, except this time let's use the Linux IP command. So I'm going to type the most famous version of the IP command, IP ADDR. Now when I type this, you can see we've got a lot of great information. And now you'll notice I've got two adapters on here. One of them is just the loopback LO, and right here is my actual Ethernet right here. So we take a look. We've got examples. We've got our MAC address here. We've got our IP address. We've got our subnet mask as WAC24. We can see it's dynamic. There's a ton of information in here. Here's our link local address for IPv6. So I can go in here and get a quick snapshot of what's going on with my system, in particular my MAC address, my IP configuration. So that's why we put ipconfig and the IP command together. It's different operating systems, but they really do the same thing. Okay, that was fun, but I think it's time to start moving into the world of DNS. Anybody feeling like a little NS lookup? DNS problems can drive you absolutely bonkers, and that's when we turn to tools like good old NSLookup and the slightly better DIG. Now before I get started here, I need to warn you. DNS has been a problem now for years in terms of bad guys doing things. So a lot of the query tools that we use, like NSLOOKUP and Dig, have been kind of, well, shut down. It's not that the tools don't know how to query, it's just DNS servers have learned not to make responses to these types of tools. So a lot of the things we used to be able to do with NSLOOKUP and Dig are kind of gone. However, if you need to make queries to DNS servers, there are some things we can still do with these tools. And probably the most important one is, what is my DNS server? You know what? Let's make it the most important too. What is my DNS server? And then the other question you can ask is this particular system a DNS server? So let's say you've got a scenario where your DNS simply isn't working. NSLOOKUP is going to be the tool to turn to query your DNS server and check things. Now, I'm going to be using NSLOOKUP in Windows, but keep in mind that NSLOOKUP also works just fine in Linux as well. So NSLOOKUP. Now, you can type it by itself and put it into interactive mode. I personally don't like that, so I'm going to do stuff like this. I'm going to do NSLOOKUP www.totalsem.com. So what I'm doing right here is I've made a query and I want to know what server am I using for DNS, and then what is the IP address for www.totalsem.com. And if you take a look, you'll see that my DNS server is currently this machine called totalhomedc2.totalhome, and then the address is an internal address. So I know that I've got an internal DNS server. I'm just not using my Comcast DNS or whatever it might be. And it does a query for me and it tells me the IP address. Now that's handy, but we can do a couple of other things too. For example, I am going to go into interactive mode. Now watch what happens. So it's just going to sit here like this, and I'm going to change my DNS server. So what I've done is I've said, I don't care what my DNS server normally is, I want you to try a different one. When you run into scenarios where you're worried that your DNS server might be the problem, running NSLOOKUP and just quickly making a change and go, well, let's try this server, and we can go ahead and see if things work better. Now, I have famous public DNS servers like 8.8.8.8 memorized, but I can go ahead and just do little queries right here and see if anything comes up. So you can see what I've done is I've queried totalsem.com again. I got the same IP address as I should, but you'll see that I'm using a different DNS server. NSLOOKUP is a great way, instead of going into your system and actually changing your DNS settings, you can just use NSLOOKUP and go, look, my DNS server isn't working, let me try another one and see if everything starts to suddenly work. So it does a really good job with that. Now, NSLOOKUP used to be able to do a lot more, but it's been pretty much shut down. The DNS servers don't allow the types of queries that NSLOOKUP does. However, there is one tool that's a little bit better than NSLOOKUP, and that tool is called Dig. Now, there is not a native Windows version of Dig that I know of. There's third-party tools that actually work great, even some graphical ones. But if you really want to get into Dig, we've got to head over to Linux. All right, so here I am in a Linux system, and I'm just going to run a couple of Dig commands so you can get some idea of some of the power that you can do. Now, Dig will work like NSLOOKUP. So if I've got a scenario where I'm worried about a particular system, I can go ahead and run Dig and then whatever domain I want. Now, there's a couple of things that are interesting here. You can see that it resolves totalsem.com just fine right here. But notice what its server is. It's a local server. It's simply telling us that there's a cache on this. This system's been asking about www.totalsem.com so much that it had it locally and it's ready to rock and roll. So just like with NSLOOKUP, if we want to change the DNS server, it's no big deal. All we do is we type in an @ sign and then the IP address of whatever server we want to use. And you'll see that I get the same response as I should, but notice down here, you'll see that the server has changed to reflect that I'm using a different box. Now, there are a few small things you can do with Dig that you cannot do with NSLOOKUP. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that you can query certain records. For example, Start of Authority or MX records. Say you're looking for a mail server, you can actually query a domain to determine things like that. So let's just do one example where I'm going to query totalsem.com and find out what the mail server is. So I'll type dig and then MX and then whatever I'm interested in. And you'll see what's happened here is that I now see the MX record. Hey, looks like Total Seminars is using Office 365. It says Outlook.com. So you can see Dig has a little bit more power than NSLookup in that it can query more public records like Start of Authority, Name Server, MX records, things like that. But you're not going to be able to use Dig to query things like A records, where suddenly it discovers every host in your network because all your A records pop up. That stuff has been pretty well blocked off. All right, that stuff was fun, but I've got one more very, very interesting tool I want to show you, Netcat. I wish I could talk for 2 hours about this one utility, Netcat. Netcat is the Swiss Army knife, does anything utility that runs on Linux systems that gives you the opportunity to do stuff that's actually kind of fascinating. Netcat, because it's a Swiss Army knife, does so very many things that it's almost hard to wrap it up. But let me get you through the Security Plus. Basically, Netcat can open and listen on ports, and it can also open and act as a client on just about any port you want. So let me give you a quick example here. So I'm going to type sudo netcat, I'm going to type in -L, and then I can just type in any arbitrary port that I want. Let's use something that's rare and weird. And what I've just done is I've opened up port 231 on this system as a listening port. So what I'm going to need to do is open up another terminal here. And on this terminal, I'm going to just run netstat just so we can see the results of this. Get back up towards the top. And if you see right there, you can see that this system is now listening on port 231. Now, the downside to this is that it's just an open port. So if I opened up a listening port on port 80, for example, I would take input from clients who were querying it. Now, it's not a real web server, so it wouldn't be able to respond. But the important thing is that with Netcat, and this is the other part of Netcat that's fun, I can open a port as a client. And by opening it as a client, I can just take a text file that's got all kinds of evil testing stuff and start attacking a particular web server, or I can do all kinds of strange queries. I can do all kinds of stuff. Netcat is a tool for aggressive action. You're using Netcat because you're doing a vulnerability assessment or you're doing some form of pen testing and you want to do what's known as banner grabbing, where you're just trying to get a server to respond and go, oh, hi, I am the HTTP server. In these types of situations, it gives you the ability to be able to do stuff like if you opened up a web browser, I mean, things like Chrome, they're not going to let you type naughty things in because Google likes their product. But with Netcat, you can do stuff like that. Netcat can be used for so much more, and I'm just barely touching this. You can do file transfer with it. You can do just about anything. But remember, the most important thing about Netcat is it is a tool for aggressive use. It's not something that your administrator is going to be running on a daily basis. All right, well, I think we have finally covered all of the different OS utilities that you're going to be seeing on the CompTIA Security Plus exam. Take some time, play with these tools, and most importantly, understand the scenarios where you're going to be applying them because you're going to see it on the exam.